Lesson number 17, Exercises in Journalizing. In this lesson, we are going to learn examples of journal entries. Let's put into practice what we had learned in the previous lesson. We are going to journalize all transactions of Pamintuan consultancy services for March 2017. I'll be using a journal I had created using Microsoft Excel. You can create one like it, or if you want to experience the real thing, you may purchase a journal in your local bookstores. Okay? Let's start. By the way, in our analysis, we show the effects of increase in owner's capital, owner's withdrawal, income and expenses to owner's equity. So if there's an increase in expense, we showed it as a negative amount because an increase in expense decreases owner's equity. It's just how we presented our analysis. When we journalize the transactions, we are no longer going to relate the increase or decrease in owner's capital, owner's withdrawal, income and expense to owner's equity as a whole. We are just going to record the increase or decrease of these accounts individually. Just a review of our previous discussion, an increase in owner's capital is credited. An increase in owner's withdrawal is debited, an increase in income is credited, and an increase in expense is debited. Our first transaction, on March 1, Chito Pamintuan invested 100,000 pesos cash to establish a business consultancy firm. Cash increased by 100,000 and Pamintuan capital increased by 100,000 pesos as well. As I've mentioned, we are no longer going to relate Pamintuan capital to owner's equity. Again, cash increased by 100,000, Pamintuan capital increased by 100,000. When we journalize, we are not going to use the terms increase or decrease. Instead, we are going to use debit or credit. So let us journalize this transaction. To journalize our first transaction, first, we have to write the date. So under the date column, first we write the year, 2017. Then the month, March, and the day, 1. Under the description column, we write our debit entry, credit entry, and then the brief description of the transaction. So what is our debit entry? Correct, cash. Cash is debited because cash increased by 100,000. So we're going to write the amounts under the debit column, 100,000 pesos. Please take note, under the debit and the credit columns, these columns are further divided into mini or sub-columns. The rightmost sub-column is for centavos, then ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s, and the millions place. So please be very careful in writing the digits in the respective sub-columns. So cash increase, so cash is debited for 100,000 pesos. Our credit entry is Pamintuan capital. We credited Pamintuan capital because Pamintuan capital increased. Same amount, 100,000 pesos, we are going to write the amount under the credit column. If you would notice, I had indented Pamintuan capital because that's how we distinguish it from the debit entry. Okay? Indent the credit entry. Next, we write a very brief description about the transaction. Invested cash to establish a business consultancy firm. If you would notice, just like the credit entry, I had indented the description in order to distinguish it from the debit entry and then the credit entry. Under the posting reference, we are not going to write any data. For the meantime, we're going to supply the data when we perform the next step, which is posting. So when we journalize, we're going to leave it blank until we perform the next step, which is posting. March 2 transaction, the business paid 3,500 for the business permit and BIR registration. Based on our analysis, cash decreased by 3,500 and taxes and licenses increased by 3,500. Ignore the negative amount in our analysis. Expense increase So owner's equity decrease, that's why we have a negative amount. As I've mentioned, when we journalize, we are just going to determine the increase of owner's capital, owner's withdrawal, income and expense individually without reference to their effects to owner's equity. To journalize the second transaction, first we have to write the date. So this time we're just going to write the date, which is 2, March 2. We don't have to write the year and the month again. We can do that on the second page of the journal. So we have 2, March 2. We debit taxes and licenses because taxes and licenses increase. How do we show the increase in an expense? We debit it. Under the debit column, we write 3,500. Our credit entry, okay, we have a credit to cash. So again, credit entry should be indented to distinguish it from the debit entry. Credit cash, 3,500. We had credited cash because cash decreased because there's a payment. Then we write the description. Paid the business permit and BIR registration. March 4, the business purchased a desktop computer for 25,000 pesos on credit to be used in the business. Office equipment increased by 25,000 pesos. Accounts payable increased by 25,000 pesos. To journalize the March 4 transaction, first we have to write the date. So under the date column, we write 4 for March 4. We debit office equipment for 25,000 pesos. We credit accounts payable, 25,000 pesos, because that's how we increase a payable. If we want to increase a payable, we credit it. Then write the description, purchase a desktop computer in credit to be used in the business. Another March 4 transaction, the business purchased bond papers, pens, pencils, memo, and other supplies for cash amounting to 3,200. Office supplies increased to 3,200. Cash decreased 3,200. This transaction occurred on March 4. Since our previous transaction also occurred on March 4 and we had already written the date March 4 on that transaction, we don't have to write that date again. So we can just leave the date column for this transaction without any data, supplying any data. It is understood that this transaction is also a March 4 transaction. So we just have to debit office supplies, 3,200, credit cash, 3,200 because cash was decreased. Then write the description, purchase bond papers, pens, pencils, memo, and other supplies for cash. Next transaction, on March 4, the business paid rent in advance for 3 months, 15,000 pesos. Prepaid rent increased, 15,000 pesos. Cash decreased 15,000 pesos. This transaction also occurred on March 4, so there's no need to write the date March 4 again. Debit prepaid rent, 15,000 pesos. Credit cash, 15,000 pesos because there's a payment. Then write the description, paid rent in advance for 3 months. March 6, the business purchased tables, chairs, and cabinets amounting to 20,000 pesos. It paid 5,000 pesos and the balance payable in 3 equal monthly installments. Furniture and fixtures increased by 20,000 pesos. Cash decreased by 5,000 pesos. Accounts payable increased by 15,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we write the date 6. We debit furniture and fixtures for 20,000 pesos. We credit cash 5,000 pesos because there was a payment of cash, so there was a decrease in cash. Then credit accounts payable 15,000 pesos because accounts payable increase. Description, purchase tables, chairs, and cabinets with partial payment. March 7, the business paid 3,000 pesos for advertisement in a radio station to promote the business. Cash decreased by 3,000 pesos. Advertising expense increased by 3,000 pesos. Again, in journalizing this transaction, we are no longer going to relate advertising expense to owner's equity. So advertising expense increased by 3,000 pesos. To record the transaction, we write the date 7 for March 7, debit advertising expense 3,000 pesos, credit cash 3,000 pesos, then write the description paid for advertisement in a radio station to promote the business. March 10, the business rendered a business consulting service to an IT company for 10,000 pesos. Cash increased by 10,000 pesos. Consulting revenue increased by 10,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we write the date 10 for March 10, debit cash 10,000 pesos, credit consulting revenue 10,000 pesos. That's how we increase revenue or income. We credit it. Then write the description, render the business consulting service to an IT company. March 12, the business paid 10,000 pesos to partially settle the account from the purchase of desktop computer last March 4. Cash decreased by 10,000 pesos. Accounts payable also decreased by the same amount, 10,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we write the date 12. We debit accounts payable 10,000 pesos. A debit to accounts payable means the accounts payable was decreased. Credit cash 10,000 pesos. Description, partial payment to settle the account from the purchase of desktop computer on March 4. March 15, the business completed a marketing consulting service to a newly established business for 50,000 pesos. The business collected 20,000 pesos and the balance to be received next month. Cash increased by 20,000 pesos. Accounts receivable increased by 30,000 pesos and consulting revenue increased by 50,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we write the date 15. We debit cash for 20,000 pesos. Debit accounts receivable 30,000 pesos. Credit consulting revenue 50,000 pesos. Then the description, completed a marketing consulting service to a newly established business with partial receipt. If you would notice, we have two debit entries. So debit entries should be aligned. And so with the credit entries, it doesn't matter if we have two or more debit or credit entries. Debit entry should be aligned. Credit entry should be aligned as well. March 17, the business rendered a consulting service on credit to a retail store for 25,000 pesos. Accounts receivable increased by 25,000 pesos. Consulting revenue increased by 25,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we write the date 17. Debit accounts receivable 25,000 pesos. Credit consulting revenue 25,000 pesos. Write the description, rendered a consulting service on credit to a retail store. March 19, the business paid the monthly installment for the purchase of tables, chairs, and cabinets last March 6. Cash decreased by 5,000 pesos. Accounts payable decreased by 5,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we write the date 19. Debit accounts payable 5,000 pesos. Credit cash 5,000 pesos. Write the description, pay the monthly installment for the purchase of tables, chairs, and cabinets on March 6. March 20, the business received 40,000 pesos in advance from a client for a marketing consulting engagement. Cash increased by 40,000 pesos. Unearned revenue increased by 40,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we write the date 20, debit cash 40,000 pesos, credit unearned revenue 40,000 pesos because unearned revenue is a liability account. In order to increase a liability, we credit it. Write the description, received cash in advance from a client for a marketing consulting engagement. March 22, the business completed a consulting service for a manufacturing company for 50,000 pesos. 50% was collected and the balance to be received next month. Cash increased by 25,000 pesos. Accounts receivable increased by 25,000 pesos. Consulting revenue increased by 50,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we write the date, 22. Debit cash, 25,000 pesos. Debit accounts receivable, 25,000 pesos. Credit consulting revenue, 50,000 pesos. The description, completed a consulting service for a manufacturing company with partial receipt. March 26, the business paid the water bill for the month, 300 pesos. Cash decreased by 300 pesos. Utilities expense increased by 300 pesos. To journalize the transaction, write the date, 26. Debit utilities expense, 300 pesos because utilities expense increased. Credit cash, 300 pesos. The description, paid the water bill for the month. On March 30, the business paid the salary of its assistant, 4,000 pesos. Cash decreased by 4,000 pesos. Salaries expense increased by 4,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we write the date, 30. We debit salaries expense for 4,000 pesos because salaries expense increased. In order to increase an expense, salaries expense, we debit it. Credit cash, 4,000 pesos. Then the description, pay the salary of his assistant. March 30, the business collected a 25,000 pesos account of the retail store. Cash increased by 25,000 pesos. Accounts receivable decreased by 25,000 pesos. This transaction also occurred on March 30. So since we had already written the date March 30 in our previous transaction that also occurred on March 30, so there is no need to write the date for this transaction. Just debit cash, 25,000 pesos, and credit accounts receivable for the same amount. We credited accounts receivable because there was a collection. Every time there's a collection, accounts receivable will be decreased. How do we show a decrease in accounts receivable? We credit it. The description, collected the account of the retail store on March 17. March 30, Mr. Pamintuan attended a seminar in Manila. The cost of transportation and accommodation are 1,700 pesos and 1,500 pesos respectively. Cash decreased, 3,200. Traveling expense increased by 3,200. To record the transaction, we debit traveling expense, 3,200. We credit cash, 3,200. The description, payment for the transportation and accommodation to attend a seminar in Manila. March 31, the owner withdrew 2,000 pesos for personal use. Cash decreased by 2,000 pesos. Pamintuan withdrawals increased by 2,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we write the date, 31. We debit Pamintuan withdrawals for 2,000 pesos. We debit Pamintuan withdrawals because this account increased. The account increased because the owner withdrew money from the business. How do we increase the withdrawal account? We debit it. Pamintuan withdrawals, debit 2,000 pesos. Credit cash, 2,000 pesos. Description, withdrew cash for personal use. March 31, the business received 8,000 pesos for a business consulting service. Cash increased by 8,000 pesos. Consulting revenue increased as well for 8,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we debit cash, 8,000 pesos. We credit consulting revenue, 8,000 pesos. The description, received cash for a business consulting service. Our last transaction, on March 31, the business received the electric bill for the month amounting to 1,000 pesos. Utilities payable increased by 1,000 pesos. Utilities expense increased also by 1,000 pesos. To journalize the transaction, we debit utilities expense 1,000 pesos. we credit utilities payable 1,000 pesos. Then the description, receive the electric bill for the month. Okay, we had just completed our exercises in journalizing. I hope you learned something, guys. See you in our next lesson.